The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Mesa Verde, a small border town that most people drove through without stopping. David Martinez had lived here his entire 34 years, working as a mechanic at the only auto shop in town. He knew every pothole, every broken streetlight, and every family that called this forgotten place home. But on this particular Tuesday in September, something felt different. David noticed it first when he arrived at work. The usual early morning quiet was broken by the distant hum of unmarked vehicles moving through the outskirts of town. Black SUVs with tinted windows had been appearing more frequently over the past month, always at dawn, always heading toward the old warehouse district near the railroad tracks. David's curiosity had always been both his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. His late father used to joke that David would investigate a suspicious shadow if it meant solving a mystery. As he wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag, David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of focusing on the broken transmission in front of him, he told his boss he needed to check on a customer's car and quietly slipped out the back door. The warehouse district had been abandoned for over a decade. Rusted metal buildings stood like silent sentinels, their broken windows reflecting the morning light. David parked his pickup truck behind a collapsed loading dock and approached on foot. The sound of engines grew louder as he crept closer to the largest building, its faded sign still barely readable. Southwest Distribution Center. What David saw through a gap in the corrugated metal wall made his blood run cold. Inside the warehouse, 7 people sat on the concrete floor, their hands bound behind their backs. They ranged in age from what looked like teenagers to elderly adults. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Standing guard over them were 3 men in tactical gear, automatic weapons slung across their chests. David's mind raced as he tried to process what he was witnessing. These weren't criminals or suspects, they were victims. The way they huddled together, the terror on their faces, the careful way the guards watched them. This was human trafficking. In his own hometown, in a place where everyone was supposed to know everyone else. One of the guards spoke into a radio, his voice carrying across the empty space. "Transport arrives at 1400. Package is secure." David's stomach twisted at the casual way the man referred to human beings as cargo. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking as he tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The warehouse district had always been a dead zone for cell service. As David carefully backed away from the building, his boot caught a piece of loose metal. The scraping sound echoed through the morning air like a gunshot. He froze, his heart pounding so loud he was sure the guards could hear it. Voices inside the warehouse became urgent, and David heard footsteps moving toward the wall where he was hiding. Without thinking, David ran. He sprinted back to his truck, started the engine, and drove toward town as fast as he dared without attracting attention. His mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. Who were these people? Where were they being taken? And most importantly, who in his small town was involved in something this horrible? When David reached the main street, he noticed something that chilled him even more than what he had witnessed at the warehouse. Sheriff Johnson's patrol car was parked outside the diner, just like every Tuesday morning. But today, the sheriff was deep in conversation with a man David had never seen before. A man wearing the same type of tactical gear he had just seen at the warehouse. David drove past slowly, trying not to stare, but he caught enough of their conversation to confirm his worst fears. The sheriff nodded as the stranger handed him an envelope. Money was changing hands. The very person who was supposed to protect the people of Mesa Verde was part of whatever was happening in that warehouse. David parked behind the post office and sat in his truck, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He couldn't call the police because the police were involved. He couldn't just ignore what he had seen because 7 innocent people were counting on someone to help them. And he couldn't leave town because by the time he reached the state police, those people would be gone forever. As he sat there, David realized that sometimes ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things. His father had always taught him that a man's character is measured not by what he does when people are watching, but by what he does when he thinks no one will ever know. 7 strangers were depending on someone having the courage to act, even when that action meant risking everything. David took a deep breath, started his truck, and began to form a plan. He didn't know exactly how he was going to save those people, But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't live with himself if he walked away. The clock on his dashboard read 10:47 a.m. According to what he had overheard, transport would arrive at 2 p.m. He had less than 4 hours to figure out how one small town mechanic could take on what appeared to be a well-organized criminal operation with connections that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. David drove through the familiar streets of Mesa Verde with new eyes. Every person he passed, every building he had known since childhood, now seemed potentially connected to the horror he had discovered. He needed help, but who could he trust? The answer came to him as he passed the small Catholic church where his grandmother had taken him every Sunday as a child. Father Miguel Santos had been the parish priest for 15 years. He was originally from El Salvador and had seen enough violence and corruption in his homeland to recognize it anywhere. More importantly, he was one of the few people in town who had always stood up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. If anyone would believe David's story and help him figure out what to do, it would be Father Miguel. David found the priest in the church garden, tending to the tomato plants that fed many of the town's poorest families. Father Miguel was a small man with calloused hands and kind eyes, but David had seen him face down angry crowds and corrupt officials with unwavering determination. When David quietly explained what he had witnessed, the priest's face grew grave. "I have suspected something like this for months," Father Miguel said, setting down his gardening tools. "Families have been disappearing from the migrant camps outside town. People who were here one day, gone the next, with no explanation. The authorities always said they had moved on voluntarily, but I never believed it." The priest looked toward the warehouse district, his jaw tightening. "Show me." Together they drove to a hill overlooking the warehouse complex. Through binoculars borrowed from the church, Father Miguel confirmed what David had seen. The 7 captives were still there, and the guards had been joined by 2 more men. A large truck with Arizona plates had arrived and was being prepared for loading. "We have to call the FBI," Father Miguel said. "This is beyond what local authorities can handle, especially if Sheriff Johnson is involved." But when they tried calling from the priest's cell phone, they encountered the same problem David had faced. There was no signal in this part of town. They drove back toward the center of Mesa Verde, but as they passed the sheriff's office, they saw something that stopped them cold. Sheriff Johnson was standing outside with 3 strangers, all wearing suits despite the desert heat. One of them was speaking into a radio, and David caught enough words to understand they were coordinating with the warehouse team. "The state police," David suggested, but Father Miguel shook his head. "Look at their license plates," he said, pointing to the black sedans parked behind the building. "Government plates. This goes higher than we thought." David felt a crushing weight settle on his shoulders. How could 2 ordinary citizens take on an operation that seemed to involve multiple levels of law enforcement? But as they sat in the priest's old pickup truck, watching the men in suits coordinate their activities, David noticed something that gave him hope. Maria Gonzalez was walking her dog past the sheriff's office just like she did every afternoon. Maria worked as a dispatcher for the state police, 60 miles away in the county seat. More importantly, she was Father Miguel's niece and someone David had known since they were children. If anyone could get word to honest law enforcement officers, it would be Maria. Father Miguel approached his niece carefully, asking her to join them for coffee at the diner. Once they were seated in a corner booth far from other customers, David quietly told Maria what they had discovered. Her reaction confirmed their worst fears and their best hopes. "There have been rumors," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Internal Affairs has been investigating reports of missing persons along the border, but every time they get close to something, the cases get transferred to federal agencies and disappear. My supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, has been asking questions, but he's been told to focus on other matters." Maria pulled out her personal cell phone and scrolled through her contacts. "Captain Rodriguez is one of the good ones. He grew up poor, worked his way through school, and became a cop because he genuinely wanted to help people. If I can get him the right information, he'll act on it, regardless of who tells him not to." But there was a problem. Maria couldn't simply call her supervisor and report a kidnapping based on second-hand information. They needed proof. Photographs, video, something concrete that would force law enforcement to act immediately. And time was running out. David looked at his watch. It was already past noon, and the transport was scheduled to arrive in less than 2 hours. 7 innocent people were counting on them to do something, anything, that would prevent them from disappearing forever into a network that stretched far beyond their small town. "I have an idea," David said, "but it's dangerous." He explained his plan to Father Miguel and Maria. The priest would create a distraction at the front of the warehouse, something that would draw most of the guards away from the captives. Meanwhile, David would sneak in through the back and document what was happening with his phone camera. Maria would wait at a safe distance with her car running, ready to speed to the state police headquarters with the evidence. "And if something goes wrong?" Maria asked. David met her eyes and saw the same determination that had driven him to investigate the warehouse in the first place. "Then at least we'll know we tried," he said. "These people don't deserve to disappear just because we were too afraid to act." Father Miguel placed his hands on the table and looked at both of them. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "This morning, during early mass, I overheard Sheriff Johnson talking to Mayor Williams. They were discussing a shipment that needed to go smoothly today. The mayor said something about maintaining their arrangement with the syndicate. The implications hit them like a physical blow. This wasn't just a criminal operation. It was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of their local government. The mayor, the sheriff, and probably others were all involved in human trafficking. David realized that even if they could save these 7 people, many more would follow unless they could expose the entire network. As they prepared to leave the diner, David felt a strange mixture of terror and clarity. He had never considered himself a hero, never imagined he would be in a situation like this. But sometimes, he realized, heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and acting anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. The warehouse district seemed even more ominous as David crept through the shadows of abandoned buildings. Father Miguel had already driven to the front entrance, where he would soon begin his distraction. The plan was simple but risky. The priest would claim he was looking for homeless individuals who might need shelter, giving David time to slip in through a broken loading dock on the opposite side of the building. David's heart pounded as he approached the rear of the warehouse. Through gaps in the metal siding, he could see that the situation inside had become more urgent. The 7 captives were now being prepared for transport, their hands bound with zip ties, cloth bags placed over their heads. 2 men were checking a large refrigerated truck that had arrived during the last hour. As David positioned himself to record everything with his phone, he noticed details that made his stomach turn. The youngest captive appeared to be a teenage girl, probably no older than 16. An elderly man sat beside her, his shoulders shaking with what David realized were silent sobs. These weren't criminals or illegal, immigrants being processed through official channels. These were victims of a sophisticated trafficking operation. Father Miguel's voice echoed from the front of the building, loud enough for David to hear clearly. "Hello, is anyone here? I'm looking for some folks who might need help." The priest was playing his role perfectly, sounding concerned but harmless. David heard the guards inside curse and saw 3 of them move toward the front entrance, leaving only 1 man watching the captives. This was David's chance. He squeezed through a gap in the loading dock and found himself inside the cavernous warehouse. The air was thick with dust and the smell of fear. David crouched behind a stack of old wooden crates and began recording with his phone, making sure to capture the faces of both the remaining guard and the captives. What David discovered next changed everything. On a table near the truck, he could see documents and what appeared to be passports. As he zoomed in with his phone camera, he realized these weren't just random kidnapping victims. They were people who had specific skills or characteristics that made them valuable to whoever was buying them. The teenage girl had medical training certificates scattered beside her. The elderly man appeared to be some kind of engineer, based on the technical drawings David could see among his possessions. Each person represented not just a human life, but specific expertise that was being sold to the highest bidder. David managed to record nearly 5 minutes of footage before Father Miguel's distraction began to wear thin. The guards at the front were becoming suspicious, and David could hear them radioing for instructions. He knew he had to leave immediately, but as he prepared to retreat, something unexpected happened. The elderly man somehow managed to remove the cloth bag from his head and looked directly at David. For a moment, their eyes met across the warehouse floor. David saw recognition in the man's face, not of David personally, but recognition that someone was there, someone who might help. The man mouthed a single word. Please. That moment of human connection nearly broke David's resolve to remain hidden. Every instinct told him to rush forward and try to free these people immediately. But he knew that would only result in his capture, and the loss of the evidence he had gathered. The most important thing was getting the video to people who could actually do something about it. David carefully backed toward the loading dock, but his movement caught the attention of the guard. The man spun around, weapon raised, scanning the shadows where David was hiding. "Who's there?" the guard shouted. "Miguel, get back here now." Father Miguel's voice came from the front entrance, still maintaining his innocent act. "I'm sorry if I'm trespassing. I was just looking for anyone who might need help from the church." But David could hear the strain in the priest's voice. He knew the situation was becoming dangerous. David made it to the loading dock just as the other guards returned from the front. He could hear them arguing with Father Miguel, their voices becoming more aggressive. The priest was in danger, and David realized their plan was falling apart. As David squeezed back through the gap in the building, he heard gunshots. Not aimed shots, but warning shots fired into the air. Someone was shouting at Father Miguel to get on the ground. David's blood ran cold as he realized the guards had decided the priest was more than just a curious do-gooder. David ran to his truck and drove to the meeting point where Maria was waiting. When he told her what had happened, she immediately called Captain Rodriguez on her secure radio. "We need immediate backup at the old Southwest Distribution Center," she said. "Officer down. Possible hostage situation, and we have evidence of human trafficking." Captain Rodriguez's response crackled over the radio. Unit 47 responding. "ETA 15 minutes. Do not approach the scene." But 15 minutes might be too long. David could see smoke rising from the direction of the warehouse. Someone had set fire to part of the building, probably to destroy evidence. Father Miguel was still inside with the captives, and David knew that the traffickers would now see everyone as witnesses who needed to be eliminated. Maria tried to convince David to wait for backup, but he was already getting back into his truck. "I can't leave him there," David said. "Father Miguel risked his life to help those people. I won't abandon him now." As David drove back toward the warehouse, he called the one person in town he thought might still be trustworthy, Dr. Sarah Chen, who ran the small medical clinic. Dr. Chen had always seemed to operate independently of the local political network, and David remembered that she had treated several people over the years who claimed to have escaped from human traffickers. "Dr. Chen, this is David Martinez," he said when she answered. "I need you to get to the old warehouse district immediately. Bring medical supplies and call every federal agency you can think of. Tell them there's an active human trafficking operation in Mesa Verde, and local law enforcement is compromised." Dr. Chen's response surprised him. "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years," she said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, and I've already got the FBI field office on speed dial." As David approached the warehouse, he realized that their small-town conspiracy was about to become a federal case. But first, he had to make sure that Father Miguel and the 7 captives survived long enough to see justice served. The smoke was getting thicker, and David could hear sirens in the distance, but he couldn't tell if they belonged to Captain Rodriguez's backup or to Sheriff Johnson's corrupt officers. David parked behind the same loading dock he had used earlier and prepared to go back into the warehouse. This time, he wasn't just gathering evidence. He was going in to save lives, even if it cost him his own. The warehouse was now filled with smoke and chaos. David could hear shouting from multiple directions as he crawled through the loading dock opening. The fire hadn't spread to the main area yet, but it was clear that someone was trying to destroy evidence while eliminating witnesses. Through the haze, David could see that the situation had deteriorated rapidly. Father Miguel was on his knees near the front entrance, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive and alert. The 7 original captives had been moved closer to the truck, and David could see that the traffickers were preparing for an emergency evacuation. What David hadn't expected was the arrival of additional players. Sheriff Johnson had arrived, with 2 deputies, but instead of rescuing the hostages, they were clearly coordinating with the traffickers. Even worse, David recognized one of the men in suits from earlier. He was now directing operations like a military commander. "Clean this up fast," the man in the suit was saying. "We've got state police en route, and our window is closing. Load everyone into the truck and get them to the secondary location." We'll deal with the priest and anyone else who's seen too much. David realized that Father Miguel wasn't just a witness anymore. He was evidence that needed to be eliminated. The same fate awaited the 7 original captives, who had now seen the faces of local law enforcement officers involved in the trafficking ring. As David tried to figure out how to help 8 people escape from armed guards, he heard something that gave him hope: the distant sound of helicopters. Dr. Chen had apparently succeeded in contacting federal authorities, and they were responding in force. But the traffickers heard the helicopters too. The man in the suit barked orders into his radio. Execute Protocol 7 immediately. No witnesses, no evidence, no exceptions. David watched in horror as several guards raised their weapons, clearly preparing to kill everyone in the warehouse. David knew he had seconds to act. He spotted a fire axe mounted on the wall near his hiding place and grabbed it. He also noticed something else. The warehouse's old electrical panel was only 20 feet away. If he could cut the main power line, the building would be plunged into darkness, giving the hostages a chance to escape in the confusion. Without allowing himself time to think about the consequences, David swung the axe at the main electrical cable. Sparks flew, and the warehouse was instantly plunged into near-total darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on, but it provided only dim illumination. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Guards shouted conflicting orders, the hostages screamed, and David heard the sound of people running in different directions. In the confusion, David made his way toward where he had last seen Father Miguel. "Miguel!" David whispered urgently. "It's David Martinez. Where are you?" "Here," came the priest's voice from nearby. "David, thank God. The people we have to help. The people." David found Father Miguel and quickly cut his zip ties with a box cutter he had grabbed from a workstation. Together, they began searching for the 7 captives in the darkness. The guards were using flashlights now, but the smoke and shadows provided good cover. They found the teenage girl first, huddled behind a stack of boxes. Her name was Elena, and she whispered that she was a nursing student who had been kidnapped while volunteering at a clinic near the border. Father Miguel cut her bonds while David kept watch. The elderly engineer was next. He introduced himself as Professor Restrepo and explained that he had been taken because of his expertise in water purification systems. "They said someone needed my knowledge for a project in another country," he said, his voice shaking. "But I knew I would never see my family again." One by one, they found the other 5 captives: a young man who spoke 3 languages and had been working as a translator, a woman who was skilled in computer programming, a teenage boy who was apprenticing as an electrician, a middle-aged man who was a master carpenter, and an older woman who was a traditional healer. Each had skills that made them valuable to whoever was purchasing human beings. As they gathered the group together, David realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't random kidnapping. It was selective harvesting of people with specific abilities. Someone somewhere was building something that required these exact skills, and they were willing to traffic human beings to get the expertise they needed. The sound of helicopters was getting closer, but so were the flashlights of the guards. David knew they had only minutes before they were discovered. The main entrance was blocked by armed men, and the loading dock where David had entered was now on fire. There, Father Miguel pointed to a small window high on the far wall. "It's our only chance." Getting 8 people through a window 12 feet off the ground seemed impossible, but David noticed a forklift parked nearby. If they could get it started without making too much noise, they could use it to reach the window. The forklift's key was in the ignition. Apparently, security hadn't been a concern in an abandoned warehouse. David had operated similar machinery at the auto shop, but never under these circumstances. He managed to start the engine quietly and raise the forks to the level of the window. Elena, being the youngest and most agile, went first. She squeezed through the narrow opening and dropped to the ground outside. Professor Restrepo was more difficult, but the translator and electrician helped boost him up and guide him through. As they were helping the 4th person escape, bright lights suddenly illuminated their area. "There they are," someone shouted. Guards were running toward them, weapons drawn. David knew there wasn't time to get everyone out through the window. He made a decision that surprised even himself. "Miguel, get the others out," he said, jumping down from the forklift. "I'll buy you time." Before Father Miguel could protest, David ran directly toward the approaching guards, shouting at the top of his lungs, "FBI, federal agents, this building is surrounded." He had no authority to make such claims, but in the darkness and confusion, his voice carried enough conviction to make the guards hesitate. That hesitation was all Father Miguel needed. He got the remaining captives through the window just as the warehouse's main doors burst open. State police officers in tactical gear poured into the building, followed by FBI agents and federal marshals. The sound of gunfire erupted as the corrupt local officials and traffickers found themselves caught between their victims' escape route and incoming federal agents. David dove behind a concrete pillar as bullets ricocheted around the warehouse. Through the chaos, David could hear Captain Rodriguez's voice on a bullhorn. "This is the state police. The building is surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender." But David knew that some of the people inside would never surrender. They had too much to lose and too many crimes to answer for. As federal agents secured the warehouse and arrested everyone they could find, David realized that the real battle was just beginning. The trafficking ring extended far beyond Mesa Verde, and the people they had saved represented only a tiny fraction of the victims. The aftermath of the warehouse raid revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than David had imagined. As FBI agents processed the crime scene, they discovered documents, computer files, and communications equipment that painted a picture of an international trafficking network with tentacles reaching across multiple countries. David found himself in a federal safe house 200 miles from Mesa Verde, along with Father Miguel and the 7 people they had helped rescue. FBI Special Agent Sarah Morrison, a veteran investigator with the Bureau's Human Trafficking Task Force, explained the situation to them. "What you stumbled onto in Mesa Verde was a procurement center for a much larger operation," Agent Morrison said, spreading photographs and documents across the conference table. The people being trafficked weren't just victims. They were specifically selected for their skills and knowledge. Elena, the nursing student, spoke up. "But why? I was just volunteering at a clinic." "I'm not anyone important." Agent Morrison pulled out a file. "According to the documents we recovered, you were targeted because of your medical training and your fluency in both Spanish and English. The trafficking network has been building teams of skilled professionals for specific projects around the world." Professor Restrepo leaned forward. "Projects? What kind of projects require kidnapping people?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Agent Morrison replied. "But based on the evidence, it appears that various criminal organizations and corrupt governments have been purchasing skilled individuals to work on everything from weapons development to infrastructure projects in remote locations." David felt sick as the implications became clear. "You mean they're building a slave labor force of educated, skilled people?" "Essentially, yes. And Mesa Verde was just one of dozens of procurement points across the southwestern United States. The operation has been running for at least 3 years, and we estimate that over 2,000 people have been trafficked through this network." Father Miguel asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "How many others are still out there?" Agent Morrison's expression grew grim. "That's what we need your help to determine. The evidence you gathered, David, has given us our first real break in this case, but the people you saw in that warehouse represent multiple levels of corruption that we're still trying to unravel." Over the following days, David learned the shocking scope of the conspiracy. Sheriff Johnson had been recruited 3 years earlier, when his gambling debts made him vulnerable to pressure from organized crime. Mayor Williams had become involved when the trafficking network offered to fund his re-election campaign in exchange for cooperation. But the corruption went much deeper. The network included a federal immigration official who had been falsifying deportation records to hide the disappearances, a judge who had been dismissing cases against suspected traffickers, and even a state senator who had been blocking legislation that would have increased penalties for human trafficking. Dr. Chen, it turned out, had been collecting evidence for 2 years after treating several people who had escaped from the trafficking network. She had been working with a group of federal agents who were investigating the operation from the outside. But they had been unable to penetrate the local conspiracy until David's evidence provided the breakthrough they needed. As the investigation expanded, David realized that his role was far from over. The video he had recorded in the warehouse had captured faces and voices that were helping the FBI identify other locations and participants in the network. But more importantly, his testimony would be crucial in prosecuting the people who had been profiting from human suffering. The 7 people they had rescued were also providing vital intelligence. Each had been told different stories about where they were being taken and what they would be forced to do. When their accounts were combined, a pattern emerged that revealed the network's ultimate destinations. Elena had been told she would be working at a medical facility in a remote part of South America. Professor Restrepo was supposed to help design water systems for a development project in Central Asia. The translator was destined for a language center that the FBI now suspected was actually a communication hub for international criminal organizations. As David listened to these accounts, he began to understand why the trafficking network had been so careful to select people with specific skills. They weren't just kidnapping random victims. They were assembling teams of professionals who could be forced to work on projects that legitimate employees would never participate in. The computer programmer, whose name was Anna, provided perhaps the most disturbing revelation. She had been told that her job would involve creating secure communication systems for a technology company. But based on the technical specifications she had been shown, Anna believed the systems were actually designed to coordinate illegal activities while avoiding detection by law enforcement. They're not just trafficking people, Anna explained to Agent Morrison. They're trafficking knowledge. They're taking people who have skills that can't be easily replaced and forcing them to use those skills for criminal purposes. This insight led to a breakthrough in the investigation. The FBI realized that they weren't just dealing with traditional human trafficking, they were confronting a new form of organized crime that specialized in the theft and exploitation of human expertise. Armed with this understanding, federal agents began raiding other locations across the country. Within a week, they had uncovered trafficking operations in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and California. Each location had been carefully designed to appear legitimate while serving as a collection point for skilled professionals. But with each raid, David learned more about the personal cost of the network's activities. Families had been searching for missing loved ones for years, never knowing what had happened to them. Professional communities had lost valuable members, never understanding why talented individuals had simply vanished. David also learned that his actions had put him in serious danger. The trafficking network included people with resources and connections that extended far beyond the borders of the United States. Agent Morrison explained that David, Father Miguel, and the 7 rescued individuals would need to remain in protective custody until the full scope of the network could be dismantled. "How long will that take?" David asked. Agent Morrison's answer was sobering. "Based on what we've learned so far, this investigation could take years, and even then we may never catch everyone involved." As David sat in the safe house, looking out at an unfamiliar landscape, he realized that his decision to investigate those black SUVs had changed his life forever. He would never be able to return to his simple existence as a small-town mechanic. But when he thought about Elena, Professor Restrepo, and the others, he knew that some changes were worth making. The question that haunted him now was whether they had acted soon enough to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss and fear that had driven the trafficking network's success for so many years. 6 months after the warehouse raid, David found himself in a federal courthouse in Denver, preparing to testify in what had become the largest human trafficking prosecution in United States history. The case had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined, encompassing a network that spanned 3 continents and involved over 200 suspects. The investigation had revealed the true scope of what Agent Morrison now called intellectual trafficking, the systematic kidnapping and exploitation of skilled professionals for criminal purposes. The network had been operating for nearly a decade, with Mesa Verde serving as just one of 43 procurement sites across North America. David's testimony was crucial because he was the only person who had witnessed the operation while it was active and had been able to document it. His video evidence had become the foundation for prosecuting not just the local conspirators, but the international masterminds who had been directing the entire operation. As David sat in the witness waiting room, he reflected on how much his life had changed. He was no longer the small-town mechanic who had stumbled onto a conspiracy. He had become a federal witness living under a new identity in a city where no one knew his history. The FBI had relocated him after receiving credible threats against his life. Father Miguel entered the waiting room, also preparing to testify. The priest had been transferred to a parish in Colorado, where he continued his work while remaining under federal protection. "How are you feeling?" Father Miguel asked. "Nervous," David admitted. "When I recorded that video, I never imagined it would lead to all this." He gestured toward the courthouse corridors, which were filled with federal agents, prosecutors, and journalists from around the world. "You saved more lives than you know," Father Miguel said. "Agent Morrison told me yesterday that they've rescued over 800 people based on information from our case. The 7 people they had originally helped escape had become key witnesses in the prosecution. Each had provided testimony that helped federal agents understand how the trafficking network operated and where other victims might be held. Elena had testified the previous week about the medical training camp where she was supposed to have been taken. Her description had led to the rescue of 37 other healthcare professionals who had been forced to provide medical support for criminal organizations. Professor Restrepo's testimony had been even more impactful. His engineering expertise had helped investigators understand that the trafficking network was building infrastructure for drug cartels and terrorist organizations. Water purification systems, communication networks, and transportation facilities were being constructed by enslaved professionals in remote locations around the world. When David was finally called to testify, he found himself facing a courtroom packed with defendants, lawyers, and observers. The lead prosecutor, Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh, guided him through his testimony methodically. "Mr. Martinez," she began, "please tell the jury what you observed on the morning of September 15th at the Southwest Distribution Center in Mesa Verde." David recounted the events clearly and calmly, describing everything from his initial curiosity about the black SUVs to his decision to enter the warehouse and document what he found. When Prosecutor Walsh played his video recording for the jury, David watched the defendants' reactions carefully. Sheriff Johnson sat with his head down, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Mayor Williams appeared to be trying to distance himself from the other defendants, whispering urgently to his attorney. But the man who had been directing operations in the warehouse, identified as Marcus Volkov, a former military contractor, stared directly at David with unconcealed hatred. During cross-examination, Volkov's attorney tried to portray David as a vigilante who had interfered with what he claimed was a legitimate federal operation. "Mr. Martinez," the defense attorney said, "you had no authority to enter that warehouse, did you?" "No," David replied, "but I also couldn't stand by and watch innocent people be loaded into a truck like cargo." "How did you know they were innocent? Did you speak with them? Did you verify their identities?" David met the attorney's eyes steadily. "I knew they were innocent because of the fear in their eyes, because of the way they were bound and blindfolded, because no legitimate operation treats human beings like that." The prosecutor's redirect examination focused on the evidence that had been discovered after the raid. David's video had led to the recovery of computer files containing the locations of dozens of other trafficking sites. Financial records showed that the network had generated over $50 million in revenue by selling skilled professionals to criminal organizations. But perhaps most importantly, David's actions had exposed a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of government. The state senator who had been blocking anti-trafficking legislation had been arrested 3 months after the warehouse raid. The federal immigration official had been found dead in his office, apparently having committed suicide when investigators closed in on him. As David completed his testimony, he realized that the courtroom proceedings represented only part of the justice that was being served. The real victory was in the lives that had been saved and the network that had been dismantled. After the trial session ended for the day, Agent Morrison briefed David on the broader impact of the case. "Because of your evidence, we've been able to cooperate with law enforcement agencies in 12 countries, she said. "The network was truly international, and dismantling it has required unprecedented cooperation." Agent Morrison showed David photographs of rescue operations that had taken place around the world. In one image, federal agents were escorting a group of engineers out of a compound in Colombia, where they had been forced to design drug processing facilities. Another photograph showed medical professionals being freed from a facility in Southeast Asia where they had been providing health care for human traffickers. Each of these operations was possible because of the intelligence we gathered from your case, Agent Morrison explained. The trafficking network kept detailed records, and those records have allowed us to trace their activities back years. David studied the photographs, trying to comprehend the scale of suffering that had been caused by the network. But he also saw hope in the faces of the people being rescued. Like Elena and Professor Restrepo, these individuals would have the chance to rebuild their lives and return to their families. What happens next? David asked. Agent Morrison's expression grew serious. The trials will continue for at least another year. We're prosecuting defendants in multiple jurisdictions, and the appeals process could take even longer. And honestly, we know there are other networks out there. What you discovered in Mesa Verde was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. As David left the courthouse that day, he understood that his role in fighting human trafficking was far from over. The case had made him a reluctant expert on a form of crime that most people didn't even know existed. He had been asked to speak at law enforcement conferences and to consult on other trafficking investigations. But more than that, David had discovered something about himself that he had never known before. When faced with a choice between his own safety and the welfare of strangers, he had chosen to act. That decision had saved 8 lives directly and hundreds more indirectly. It had also revealed a truth that would guide the rest of his life. Sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, and the measure of a person's character is whether they answer that call. 2 years after the warehouse raid that changed his life, David Martinez stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., testifying about the need for stronger federal legislation to combat intellectual trafficking. The committee room was filled with lawmakers, federal agents, and advocates for trafficking victims, all focused on preventing other networks from emerging. The trials had concluded 6 months earlier with convictions for 37 defendants, including life sentences for Marcus Volkov and the other network leaders. Sheriff Johnson had received 25 years, and Mayor Williams had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. But David knew that prosecuting individual criminals was only part of the solution. Mr. Martinez, the committee chairwoman said, based on your experience and the investigation that followed, what would you recommend to prevent similar operations in the future? David had prepared for this moment, consulting with experts and studying reports from around the world. First, we need to recognize that intellectual trafficking is fundamentally different from traditional human trafficking, he said. These networks specifically target educated professionals, and they use that expertise to cause harm on a massive scale. He explained how the investigation had revealed that the Mesa Verde network had been responsible for constructing drug processing facilities, weapons manufacturing plants, and communication systems for terrorist organizations. When you force a chemical engineer to help produce narcotics, or when you kidnap a computer programmer to design systems for coordinating terrorist attacks, you're not just harming the individuals involved, you're threatening public safety on a global scale. The committee members asked detailed questions about how such networks could be detected and prevented. David described the warning signs he had observed in Mesa Verde: sudden increases in missing persons reports, unusual movement of vehicles in remote areas, and corruption among local officials who should have been investigating disappearances. After his testimony, David was approached by Dr. Sarah Chen, who had traveled from Colorado to attend the hearing. She had become a leading advocate for trafficking victims and had established a foundation to help survivors rebuild their lives. David, she said, I want you to meet someone. Elena approached them, now 21 years old and wearing the white coat of a medical resident. She had completed her nursing degree while in witness protection and had been accepted into medical school. Dr. Martinez, she said, using the honorary title that the trafficking survivors had given him, I wanted to thank you again. You don't need to thank me, David said. You're the one who had the courage to rebuild your life after everything you went through. But I wouldn't have had that chance without you, Elena replied. And neither would hundreds of other people. Elena was right. The investigation that began with David's warehouse video had ultimately led to the rescue of 847 people from trafficking networks in 14 countries. Professor Restrepo had returned to his university and was now leading a research project on water purification systems for refugee camps. Anna, the computer programmer, had started a cybersecurity company that specialized in protecting vulnerable populations from online exploitation. Each of the 7 people David had helped escape from the Mesa Verde warehouse had not only survived, but had found ways to use their experiences to help others. Their stories had become powerful testimony in the fight against human trafficking. As David walked through the Capitol building after the hearing, he reflected on how far he had come from that morning when he first noticed the suspicious vehicles in his hometown. He was no longer David Martinez, the small-town mechanic. He had become David Martinez, federal witness, congressional consultant, and reluctant expert on intellectual trafficking. The FBI had offered him a permanent position as a consultant on trafficking investigations, and he had accepted. His mechanical skills had proven surprisingly useful in understanding the industrial facilities that trafficking networks constructed in remote locations. His ability to recognize when something wasn't quite right. The same instinct that had led him to investigate the warehouse had helped federal agents identify other trafficking operations, but David's work wasn't limited to law enforcement. He had also become a speaker and educator, traveling to universities and conferences to raise awareness about intellectual trafficking. Most people were shocked to learn that skilled professionals were being systematically kidnapped and enslaved. The more common image of trafficking victims, young women forced into prostitution, represented only part of a much larger criminal enterprise. David's message was always the same. Ordinary people have the power to recognize and report suspicious activities that could save lives. He encouraged audiences to trust their instincts when something didn't seem right, just as he had done when he noticed the pattern of black SUVs in Mesa Verde. 3 months after the congressional hearing, David received a call that brought his work full circle. Agent Morrison called to tell him that they had received a tip about suspicious activities in a small town in North Dakota. The caller was a local schoolteacher who had noticed that several skilled professionals in her community had disappeared over the past 6 months. "It sounds familiar," Agent Morrison said. "We're putting together a task force to investigate, and we'd like you to be part of it." David didn't hesitate. "When do we leave?" The investigation in North Dakota revealed another procurement site, smaller than the Mesa Verde operation, but following the same pattern. The local police chief was compromised, and the trafficking network was again targeting professionals with specific skills. But this time, federal agents were able to move quickly, before any victims could be transported to their final destinations. The raid rescued 12 people and netted evidence that led to arrests in 3 other states. As David watched the survivors being escorted to safety, he remembered the fear in Professor Restrepo's eyes when they first made eye contact in the warehouse. Now he was seeing relief and hope in the faces of 12 more people who would have the chance to return to their families and their lives. After the North Dakota operation, David realized that his work was far from finished. Intelligence gathered from various investigations suggested that while the original network had been dismantled, other groups were attempting to fill the vacuum. The demand for skilled professionals who could be forced to work on criminal projects remained high, and new trafficking operations were emerging to meet that demand. But David also knew that the fight against these networks was getting stronger. Law enforcement agencies around the world now understood the threat posed by intellectual trafficking. Legislation was being strengthened, international cooperation was improving, and most importantly, more people were aware of the warning signs that could lead to early intervention. As David returned to his apartment in Denver that evening, he thought about Father Miguel, who was still serving his parish in Colorado while continuing to work with trafficking survivors. He thought about Elena, who would soon begin her medical residency and had already announced her intention to specialize in treating trauma victims. He thought about Professor Restrepo, Anna, and all the others whose lives had been saved by one person's decision to act when action was needed. David's journey from small-town mechanic to federal consultant had taught him that heroism isn't about being fearless or extraordinary. It's about recognizing when something is wrong and having the courage to do something about it, even when that action comes with personal cost. Sometimes the most important moments in history begin with one person who decides that they cannot stand by and watch injustice occur. The fight against human trafficking would continue, but David knew that each person who chose to act, whether by reporting suspicious activities, supporting survivors, or simply refusing to ignore obvious signs of exploitation, contributed to a growing movement that was making the world safer for everyone. His story had become proof that one person's courage really could save lives and change the world.